He locks the truck at 6:40 in the morning, coffee in the console still too hot to drink, and backs out of a driveway he's pulled out of 10,000 times before. The radio's on low. Not for the music. Just so the cab isn't silent. 52 years old, a lunch cooler on the passenger seat, and a phone in his pocket that hasn't rung from a friend in longer than he'd ever admit out loud. The neighborhood is quiet. Porch lights still on. Somewhere behind one of those doors is a man just like him, doing the same thing in the same silence, thinking he's the only one. He passes the same houses every morning, the one with the basketball hoop nobody uses anymore, the one where a for sale sign sat too long, the one where a man his age lives alone since the divorce, though they've never once spoken about it, not really, just away from the mailbox. Two men, two driveways, two versions of the same quiet, and neither one aware the other is carrying it too. This is Gen X at 50-something, the generation that was told to figure it out alone and did. He'll tell you he's fine. He'll say it before you even ask. It's less an answer than a reflex, the way some men clear their throat before they speak. Fine is doing the job it was built to do, closing the door on a conversation before it opens. He'll drive to work, put in the hours, come home, mow something, fix something, sit in front of a screen with the sound too low to really hear. And somewhere in that loop a name will cross his mind, a guy he used to grab beers with, a guy from the old job, a guy from college who used to call just to talk about nothing, and he'll think I should reach out. And then he won't. Not today. Maybe this weekend. The weekend comes. It doesn't happen. He notices it happening and still can't stop it. The way you notice a habit in the exact moment you repeat it, powerless against your own routine. This is the quiet architecture of a life a lot of Gen X men are living right now, and most of them don't have language for it. They know something is missing. They just don't know when it left, or where it went, or why calling it loneliness feels like admitting to a weakness they were taught, decades ago, they weren't allowed to have. Gen X grew up as the generation in between, too young to be boomers, too old to be raised the way millennials were, and somewhere in that gap an entire emotional vocabulary got skipped. Watch him for a week and you'll see the pattern before he does. He remembers birthdays but doesn't call. He likes the photo instead of commenting. He tells himself the group chat is still there, even though he hasn't opened it in 3 months. He has a phone full of numbers and nobody he'd call on a bad night. He measures friendship now in shared history rather than present contact, as if having known someone in 1998 is the same as knowing them now. He keeps a mental list of people he should check in on, and the list gets longer instead of shorter, because every unanswered impulse adds another name to the pile of quiet guilt he carries and never mentions. He tells himself he's busy. He tells himself everyone's busy. He tells himself this is just what adulthood is. He is, in his own mind, self-sufficient. In the mirror, though, on the nights he actually looks, there's a flicker of something else. He doesn't stay in front of the mirror long enough to name it. He'll scroll past an old photo, a bachelor party, a camping trip, 5 guys who once knew everything about each other's lives, and feel something tighten in his chest for exactly as long as it takes to swipe to the next post. Society didn't build this by accident, even if no one intended it. Gen X men came of age in a culture that rewarded self-reliance as a virtue, almost as a personality trait. The guy who didn't need anybody, who solved his own problems, who showed up, did the work, and didn't complain. Researchers who study male friendship have pointed to something they call the friendship recession, a measurable decline in the number of close friends men report having, decade over decade, most sharply among men in midlife, which is exactly where Gen X sits now. Sociologists have noted that many male friendships historically formed around shared activity and shared institution. A team, a job, a bar, a church, and once a man leaves those structures, through divorce, relocation, retirement, or simply the slow drift of time, the friendships built entirely on proximity often don't survive the distance. Women, broadly speaking, are more likely to maintain friendships through direct emotional conversation. Men, broadly speaking, were trained to maintain them through doing things side by side. Remove the side-by-side activity, and for a lot of men, there's no scaffolding left to hold the friendship up. It isn't that the bond wasn't real. It's that no one ever taught them how to keep it alive without an excuse to be in the same room. Add to this a culture that quietly stopped building third places, the barbershops, the union halls, the standing Thursday poker games, and you get a generation of men whose social lives were never designed to survive middle age intact. To understand where this really starts, you have to look at the psychology underneath it, and that means going back further than any of us like to. Most of these men were boys once, and most of those boys were taught, without a single sentence of it ever being said outright, that certain things simply weren't discussed. Sadness got redirected into anger, because anger was permitted and sadness wasn't. Fear got relabeled as caution, or ignored altogether. Asking for help was, in 100 small unspoken ways, coded as failure, something men in their father's generation modeled by never doing it themselves. A boy who cried was told to toughen up. A boy who reached for comfort too often was gently, or not so gently, told he was too much. So he learned. He learned to solve it himself. He learned that needing people was a liability, that vulnerability was currency he could not afford to spend, that the safest emotional position was self-containment. By the time that boy became a man, the pattern wasn't a decision anymore. It was just who he was. It felt less like a wall he'd built and more like the shape of his own skin. Even his hobbies became solitary by design. The garage, the workshop, the long solo drive, spaces where he could be near other people's lives without ever having to open his own. And here's where the psychology gets complicated, because it rarely offers clean villains. That same self-reliance that isolates him is also the thing that got him through everything: the divorce, the layoff, the death of a parent, the years of holding a family together when nobody else was going to. Independence wasn't a flaw. It was a survival tool forged for a reason, and it worked. The tragedy isn't that he learned to be strong. The tragedy is that nobody ever taught him strength and connection weren't opposites. He was handed one virtue and told it would be enough, and it very nearly was, except for the one part of him that still, quietly, at 2 a.m. sometimes, wants to be known. This is the contradiction sitting at the center of so many of these lives, and it rarely gets said out loud, not even internally. He wants connection, and he avoids the very things that would create it. He misses his friends, and he does not call them. He craves being understood, and he gives almost no one the material to understand him with. He'll spend 45 minutes on the phone with a stranger about a warranty claim and 45 seconds with an old friend before finding a reason to hang up. He'll show up for other people constantly, moving a couch, fixing a fence, driving someone to the airport at 5 a.m, because doing is a language he's fluent in, while feeling is one he never learned to speak. He gives connection through service and starves for it through conversation, and never notices the imbalance, because the giving feels like enough to make up for what he isn't asking for in return. He'll say, "We should catch up sometime," to a man he hasn't spoken to in a year, and mean it completely, and still not follow through, because meaning it and doing it were never actually the same skill, and no one ever taught him the second one. He'll even envy men who seem to have an easy circle of friends, without ever asking himself what those men do differently, because asking that question would mean admitting he wants what they have. So ask the harder question. Not why he's lonely. That part is almost obvious once you look at it. Ask why loneliness feels safer to him than the risk of reaching out. Ask what it would cost him internally to call an old friend and say, honestly, I miss you, I've been struggling, I don't really talk to anyone anymore. Ask why that sentence, 7 words long, feels heavier to him than carrying an entire household alone for 15 years. Ask what he thinks would happen if he said it. Does he believe the friend wouldn't care? Does he believe it would make him a burden? Or is it simpler and darker than that? Does some part of him believe that needing people at all is proof that the independence he built his whole identity on was never quite real? Is he afraid of finding out that the friendship survived without him just fine? Or is he afraid of finding out it didn't? There's also this. Silence has become comfortable in a way that almost frightens him if he sits with it too long. The quiet in the truck. The quiet at the dinner table for one. The quiet where a friend's voice used to be. He's arranged his life so efficiently around not needing anyone that the machinery runs perfectly even while something underneath it is quietly starving. Isolation, once it settles into routine, stops announcing itself. It doesn't feel like crisis. It feels like Tuesday. And that may be the most dangerous part of all, not the loneliness itself, but how ordinary it has learned to look from the outside. Maybe the truth is this. He was never taught that friendship, like anything worth keeping, requires maintenance, that it doesn't survive on memory alone, that it has to be fed, however awkwardly, however imperfectly. He was taught to build things, fix things, provide for things. Nobody taught him that a friendship is also a thing that can quietly fall into disrepair if it's left alone long enough, and that noticing the disrepair, and reaching toward it anyway, isn't weakness. It might be the most honest thing he could do. Not fixed. Not solved. Just true. Tonight, in 1,000 houses like his, the television will be on low, the phone will sit face down on the counter, and a name will surface in his mind, briefly, the way it always does. He'll think about it. And somewhere in that half-second before he looks away and reaches for the remote instead, there's a version of him that almost picks up the phone.